The story does not begin with armies, nor with treaties written in trembling ink, but with a silence so old it hangs like dusk over the tent of an aging wanderer. What if the oldest war still shaking the earth was conceived not in the councils of kings, but in the shadows of a barren womb? What if the conflict burning through borders and generations began with two women, two wounds, one fragile hope, and a God who whispered a promise into the dust of a wandering man? Scripture opens the curtain gently, not with fire, but with delay. Abram, wandering under unfamiliar stars, carries a promise older than his footsteps, a covenant that glows like an ember he cannot extinguish. Sarai, his wife, watches the years pass with the bitterness of one who has counted every month with hope and buried each season with disappointment. Her hands, once steady, trembled with the weight of unfulfilled prophecy. The promise had been spoken, yet the cradle remained empty, and the emptiness began to speak louder than the divine voice. In this quiet ache, desperation became a doorway. Sarai brought forward Hagar, an Egyptian servant shaped by another land and another story, placing her not as a rival, but as a vessel, a bridge built out of human reasoning across the chasm of divine silence. Perhaps through her the child will come, Sarai said, as though the promise could be urged by human craft. A decision made in a moment of doubt stretched its shadow far beyond the walls of the tent. When Hagar conceived, the balance of the household shifted. The woman who carried the child tasted a pride the barren woman could not bear. Resentment rose like a storm wind. Sarai struck back with harshness. Hagar fled into the wilderness. And there, beneath the heat of the desert sky, the unseen God bent down and spoke the first prophecy over the unborn child. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your affliction, and he shall be a wild man, his hand against every man, and every man's hand against him. The prophecy settled over the desert like an unbroken cord, stretching far past the life of the boy, carving a temperament not from culture or soil, but from divine decree. Yet this decree did not erase mercy. Ishmael would be blessed, strengthened, multiplied, but not chosen. His future rose like a pillar of smoke, fierce and unyielding, yet outside the line through which the covenant would flow. Years passed, seasons shifted, and when Abram reached the far edge of age itself, the voice of God returned, breaking the long stillness with a declaration no nation born of Ishmael would ever accept. Sarah shall bear you a son, and his name shall be Isaac, and with him I will establish my covenant. In that single moment, the ancient fracture appeared, a dividing line drawn not by human jealousy, but by heaven's hand. One son would receive greatness, the other the promise. One would build tribes, the other a nation of priests. One would roam the desert winds, the other would carry the seed through which redemption would one day enter the world. The war that still roars through headlines began with this choice, a choice no human could undo. Isaac arrived in laughter, but his birth marked the beginning of a deeper silence for Ishmael, who watched the feast held for his younger brother become the stage for his own exile. Mockery turned into accusation, accusation into banishment. And once more the wilderness claimed him, yet the wilderness is a strange teacher, and its lessons do not fade. Across the sands, a pattern formed, an inheritance of tension, a lineage born with memory yet without covenant. Deep beneath every conflict that now shakes the earth lies the echo of that first dividing breath. It did not begin with politics. It began with a promise. It did not begin with hatred. It began with choice. And that choice, once spoken, still draws a line across nations, histories, and hearts. Now, before the story moves on, allow a question for you who listen in the quiet of your own journey. When promises delay, When years seem to fold without fulfillment, where does your heart wander? Toward trust or toward invention? And thank you for walking into this ancient tent where the first embers of an unending war were stirred. Before his first cry had fully risen into the desert air, a shadow had already stretched across the life of Ishmael, not born into violence, but into a fracture carved before his arrival. A child of flesh and promise mingled, a son who bore Abraham's blood but not Abraham's covenant. He entered the world beneath the weight of a prophecy that did not wait for age or reason to unfold. The wilderness became his cradle, the sand his witness, and the ancient sky his silent tutor. As the years passed, the tent of Abraham held two sons, one burning with chosen radiance, the other with the heat of a wounded inheritance. The household felt the strain long before history named it, for destiny often whispers before it roars. When Isaac's laughter filled the tent, the air shifted, as if the divine intention itself pressed more heavily on the earth. Ishmael, older, stronger, shaped by early sorrow, watched the promise take form in the arms of the woman who once feared she would die barren. That feast of celebration, meant to honor the child who completed a promise, became the hinge upon which two destinies swung apart. Ishmael's glance, tinged with mockery, was more than a boyish jest. It was the first spark of an ancient tension, the outward sign of an inward storm that had been forming since his mother fled into the wilderness. Sarah's voice rose with the sharpness of one defending the thin border between fulfillment and fear. Cast out this bondwoman and her son, she commanded, as if the tent could no longer hold both laughter and lament. And Abraham, torn between affection and obedience, watched the wind claim Ishmael once more. Yet in the wilderness, where human eyes see abandonment, the divine sees formation. The God who marked Ishmael with a wild spirit did not leave him to perish. A well appeared, not by chance, but by mercy, as though heaven itself refused to let the boy disappear from the map of nations. He grew tall, fierce, skilled with the bow, shaped by wind and survival, and over time the prophecy carved itself into the marrow of his people. His hand would rise against every man, not because rage is hereditary, but because destiny, once spoken, echoes through generations like a drumbeat no tribe can silence. As tribes formed from his descendants, a shared restlessness bound them, a fierce independence, a memory not written in scrolls but carried in the bones. They were born of a story that placed them near the covenant, yet outside it, a tension that would become a defining fire. Their tents stretched far across the ancient world. Their caravans carved routes through unforgiving lands. Their warriors sang poetry shaped from dust and defiance. They did not forget Abraham, but neither did they forget the wilderness. And as their identity solidified, a subtle ache pulsed beneath their pride, the ache of a birthright perceived as lost. This unrest did not remain an emotion. It became architecture, building entire cultures on the foundation of striving. Longing vindication, the sons of Ishmael learned to stand tall against every force around them. For the desert teaches a man to need no master but the wind. Yet no matter how vast their reach, the covenant remained elsewhere, tracing through Isaac like a silver thread that history could not sever. In time, as centuries unfurled like scrolls beneath the hand of providence, this tension did not fade. It crystallized. Kingdoms rose and fell, but the wound remained open, echoing in stories told beside evening fires, in rivalries that deepened across borders, in pride that sharpened like a blade. Even when greatness adorned the line of Ishmael, the heart of the prophecy remained unaltered. blessing without inheritance, strength without covenant, vastness without divine election. And still, in the midst of all this, mercy lingered. God did not curse Ishmael. He strengthened him. God did not reject his descendants. He multiplied them. But blessing is not covenant, and strength is not promise. These truths became the hidden fault line beneath later centuries, shaping tempests that would rise long after Ishmael returned to the dust. For though his story seems ancient, his shadow stretches forward, across borders still disputed, across ideologies still burning, across generations who inherit not only land or language, but a spiritual posture formed in the cradle of exile. Yet even in exile, the unseen hand remained near, waiting for the moment when wounded inheritance might become redeemed identity. For every prophecy that declares a wild man also leaves room for a transformed heart, though few notice the mercy in the margins. As this part of the story settles, a question rises gently from the sand, meant not for Ishmael, but for you in your own wilderness seasons, when rejection whispers that you stand outside the promise. What shapes your heart more, the wound or the one who watches you in the desert? And thank you for staying present in this ancient silence, where the first son's footsteps still echo beneath the turning of nations. When the winds of the desert grew quiet after Ishmael's departure, another sound rose in the tent of Abraham, not a cry of sorrow, but the whisper of a promise stepping toward fulfillment. The day came when the barren woman, who once measured her years in unanswered prayers, felt the weight of a child upon her aging arms. Isaac arrived like dawn after a lifetime of twilight, a soft radiance breaking the long vigil of silence. His birth did not erase the exile of Ishmael, but it brought into focus a truth older than both boys. The promise would travel through one path alone, unaltered by human longing or logic. Isaac was not merely a child preserved from impossibility. He was a line drawn by the hand of heaven, marking where covenant would dwell. Abraham held him with a reverence, shaped by the strange knowledge that destiny had taken root in his house, choosing one son while releasing the other into the winds. The tent, once filled with tension and unanswered questions, now carried an ancient certainty. The covenant had found its vessel. The divine intention did not rest upon age or birth order, but upon a pattern hidden within the mind of God, a pattern that would thread through all of Scripture, promise not bound to flesh, but to faith. As Isaac grew, the boy seemed wrapped in a quiet clarity, moving with the serenity of one who belonged to something larger than himself. The stories spoken over him were not of exile or striving, but of lineage and blessing. The God who had called Abraham out of his homeland whispered again through Isaac, shaping him into a living sign that the covenant was not a legend, but a stream still flowing. Yet, as Isaac's light strengthened, a shadow deepened across the lands where Ishmael's sons wandered. For every blessing spoken over Isaac, there was an echo heard in the memory of the firstborn who was not chosen. What had begun as a wounded glance across a feast now stretched into a question carried by an entire people. Why not us? This question did not spring from malice, but from identity bruised by divine election. It echoed in caravan routes, in tribal gatherings, in the unspoken language of those who knew they carried Abraham's blood but not Abraham's covenant. As Isaac's presence grew firm, so too did the divide between the promise received and the promise desired. The early stories of Ishmael's descendants speak of strength and expansion, but beneath their victories lies a subtle ache, the ache of inheritance withheld. Even when Ishmael's line prospered, it prospered outside the sacred spine of history, watching from the edges as the covenant passed through another door. Yet Isaac did not rise as a conqueror. He rose as a keeper of a promise he did not earn. His path was marked not by human superiority, but by divine selection. Redemption would one day enter the world through this line, not because Isaac's blood was holier, but because God had chosen him before either brother had drawn breath. Scripture reveals an order that overturns human expectations. The older shall serve the younger, not as humiliation, but as the unfolding of a mystery that would one day reveal the Messiah. And though Isaac never wielded this truth as a weapon, the truth itself became a dividing river. When Abraham died, the blessing rested on Isaac like a mantle, settling upon his shoulders with the weight of nations yet to be born. God spoke to him as he had spoken to Abraham, affirming that the covenant had not shifted. I will give these lands to your offspring, and through your line all nations will be blessed. The desert winds carried these words far beyond the camp, and in the hearts of Ishmael's descendants, the ancient wound did not close. Greatness had been granted to them, but greatness without covenant can feel like a crown without a throne. Even in their strength, they sensed the absence of something deeper, a promise that moved beside them but never through them. And this tension, sown in the days of Abraham, became a fire that shaped empires, beliefs, and the rising storms of future centuries. Yet there is a mystery woven into this divide. The blessing for Ishmael was real, and the covenant for Isaac was irrevocable. But both pointed forward to a unity no lineage could achieve alone. The promise that flowed through Isaac would one day open beyond blood, offering itself to all who entered through faith, even to the sons of Ishmael, not as rivals, but as brothers redeemed by the same grace. For the covenant was never meant to remain locked in the veins of one people. It was a river meant to broaden into the world. Isaac carried the seed, but the seed was destined to break open and welcome nations that once stood outside the tent. As this truth unfolds across the pages of time, the ancient tension begins to make sense, not as injustice, but as design, not as rejection, but as preparation. For the same God who chose Isaac also watched over Ishmael, waiting for the day when both lines might meet again at the foot of the same cross. So the question rises for the listener, not from Isaac or Ishmael, but from within the quiet chambers of your own longing, when God chooses a path different from the one you expected. Does your heart yield to the mystery or resist the wisdom that shapes it? Long before kingdoms rose and before nations carved their borders into the sand, the tent of Isaac held a quiet storm within it, a storm that began not with men, but with two children who had not yet seen the sun. In the hidden darkness of Rebekah's womb, a struggle erupted, a trembling of life against life, as if the very future had already entered into dispute. And the voice of the Lord broke through the silent chamber of unborn existence, declaring a mystery few could fathom. Two nations are in your womb. Two peoples shall be separated from you, and the older shall serve the younger. Destiny had spoken before either child had taken form in language or breath, and the pattern seen in Abraham's house now rose again. The divine choosing the unexpected path, overturning the logic of birth, order, and blood. Esau emerged first, a son of earth and red soil. Rugged like the wilderness, he would one day roam. His presence carried the weight of the firstborn, the rightful heir in the eyes of men. A figure shaped by the hunt and the open field. Jacob followed, small, quiet, grasping his brother's heel as if already reaching for a destiny that had reached for him first. The tent that witnessed their childhood held within it a tension older than itself. The echo of Ishmael and Isaac now mirrored in Esau and Jacob, but this time the fracture grew within the same mother, the same womb, the same nights of prayer. Esau grew into a man favored by Isaac, the father who admired the strength and rawness of a son who walked like a storm across the land. Jacob remained closer to the tents, listening, watching, shaped by silence rather than conquest. Yet the divine thread ran through Jacob, not through the one who carried the earth's strength, but through the one who carried heaven's whisper. When the moment came for the birthright to be traded, Esau offered it with a casual hunger, unaware that the exchange was not merely a transaction of inheritance, but a revelation of posture. For the birthright symbolized more than property. It held the blessing. The mantle, the covenant, Jacob acquired it not through force, but through a destiny already spoken. And when Isaac, aged and dim of sight, laid his trembling hands upon Jacob, speaking blessing that could not be revoked, the fracture between brothers reached its breaking point. Esau cried out, not with the anger of a wounded boy, but with the anguish of a man who felt fate slipping from his grasp. Is he not rightly named Jacob? He wept, for he has supplanted me these 2 times. The tents of their father could no longer contain the storm. Hatred rose, not only against Jacob, but against the choosing that had bypassed Esau. And in his bitterness, a lineage was formed. People whose ancient grievance would echo across generations. Esau became Edom, a nation shaped not by covenant but by resistance. Their footsteps traced the southern edges of Canaan. Watching Israel ascend, their hearts hardened by memory. When Israel left Egypt and sought passage, Edom refused. When Jerusalem fell to Babylon, Edom rejoiced amid the ruins. The prophets bore witness to this pattern, condemning not their identity, but their posture, a spirit that stood against the covenant, not out of foreign hostility, but out of wounded kinship. And through centuries, the line of Esau intertwined with the line of Ishmael, merging 2 wounds into one, 2 ancient exclusions into a shared identity. Tribes intermarried, cultures blended, bitterness layered itself across borders unseen. The descendants of Ishmael carried the sting of exile. The descendants of Esau carried the sting of reversal. Together they formed a vast and restless people, shaped by longing, yet driven by defiance. A people who knew they belonged to Abraham's blood, yet found themselves outside Abraham's blessing. This dual fracture became one of the deepest roots of the tensions that later defined the Middle Eastern world. For here were 2 lineages who had watched the covenant pass them by, not because they lacked strength, not because they lacked identity, but because God had chosen a path hidden from human pride. Yet even in their grief, the divine hand did not close. Esau was given lands and kings. Ishmael was given princes and nations. The blessings offered to them were real, yet different from the covenant that flowed through Isaac and Jacob. They were not forgotten, but they were not chosen. And human nature rarely makes peace with such design. So the rivalry matured into nations. The resentment fermented into culture. And the memory of loss carved itself into the spiritual imagination of an entire region. Still, the covenant stood unbroken, held not by those who felt deserving, but by those chosen for a purpose greater than themselves. And the pattern became clear. Heaven's choosing is not guided by firstborn strength, nor by human tradition, but by a wisdom that sees the end from the beginning. As this part of the story settles into the dust of time, a question turns toward you who listen. When life hands you a path that seems lesser than the one you expected, does envy shape your steps? Or does humility open your eyes to the hidden purpose moving beneath the surface of your days? When the dust of Abraham's generation settled into the earth, 2 vast lines began to unfurl across the landscape of time, moving like twin rivers that shared a source but not a destination. On one side stood the sons of Ishmael, 12 in number, princes born beneath the hard sky of the wilderness, shaped by wind and wandering. On the other side rose the sons of Jacob, 12 as well, not princes but patriarchs, men whose names would one day form the very architecture of a nation. Both lines carried Abraham's blood, but only one carried his covenant. And so the desert watched as these 2 houses, equal in number but unequal in calling, began to write 2 different histories upon the same earth. Ishmael's sons spread like a wide and restless tide, their tents rising across the barren lands east and south of Canaan, Each son became the root of a tribe, and each tribe grew into a people, fierce and enduring, bound by memory and survival. Their identity was sharpened by the wilderness, for the desert does not grant comfort. It shapes those who walk it into iron. They learn to read the wind as others read scripture, to find paths where none seem visible, to build loyalty through hardship rather than law. Their greatness was born from motion, a civilization not carved in stone but carried in blood and breath. Meanwhile, Jacob's household moved along a different path, one guided not by the open sky but by a hidden thread of divine intention. The 12 sons who gathered round their father carried destinies that would one day form the spine of Israel. They were not molded by sandstorms but by stories, by dreams, by a covenant that grew heavier with every generation. Their identity was not scattered like the tents of Ishmael but concentrated, refined through famine, slavery, deliverance, and law. They would be shaped by plagues and parted seas, by pillars of cloud and fire, by commandments carved into stone by a hand no eye could see. Where Ishmael's sons learned endurance, Jacob's sons learned obedience. Where Ishmael's line forged identity in the shifting dunes, Jacob's line anchored theirs upon revelation. And yet, the distance between them was never as wide as the land suggested. For both lines carried something the other felt but could not claim. Ishmael's 12 princes bore a memory of exclusion, a sense of being near to the flame but never chosen to carry it. Jacob's 12 tribes bore the weight of divine purpose, a calling too heavy for the frailty of human nature. And so the world began to form around these two great houses, two collections of 12, moving in parallel like constellations set into motion on the first night of creation. As the centuries unfolded, Ishmael's descendants expanded in every direction, merging with the tribes of Esau, with the sons of Keturah, with wanderers whose names were lost in the sand. They became traders who stitched the ancient world together, warriors who rode like storms across the horizon, poets who carved pride and longing into the wind. Their greatness was undeniable, yet always shadowed by an ache older than their stories. The ache of a promise never quite within reach. Jacob's sons, however, were drawn down into Egypt, into bondage that forged them into a unified people. Their 12 names began as brothers, but emerged as tribes, each with its banner, its blessing, its territory promised but not yet held. Israel became a nation not by birthright but by fire, by judgment, by deliverance. Their journey was not outward expansion but inward formation, a people shaped to carry the ark of a covenant the world could not comprehend. Two nations of 12, both growing, both rising, yet walking two different roads. One moved with the wildness of the desert, the other with the gravity of destiny. One built identity on memory, the other on revelation. One carried the cry of the rejected son, the other carried the promise of the chosen line, and even the heavens seemed to pause as these two houses continued to expand. For their paths were never fully separate. Their borders touched, their stories collided, their descendants intermingled, sometimes in peace, often in rivalry, yet the deeper truth remained hidden beneath the visible world. The truth that these two lines were being prepared for a future clash that neither fully understood. Some ancient teachers spoke of a council above the earth, where unseen watchers traced the movements of tribes and kings. And if one could listen closely, it was as though the heavens observed these two houses with a solemn awe, recognizing that the rise of each would shape the destiny of entire civilizations. For Ishmael's 12 sons would lay the foundation for a vast world that drew its strength from the desert and its identity from a wound. And Jacob's 12 sons would carry the thread of redemption, a thread that would one day lead to a manger, a cross, and a crown. These two rivers, born from the same spring, flowed through history with increasing speed, shaping empires, beliefs, and wars yet to be fought. And as they widened, the world narrowed toward an inevitable meeting place, a crossroads where lineage would no longer be enough, where identity would bow before truth, and where the covenant would reveal its final purpose. As the chapter of these twin houses settles, a question rises for the listener who walks between their shadows. When two paths diverge before you, one marked by striving and one marked by surrender, which river calls your name, and which current shapes the steps of your heart? It did not begin in a throne room, nor in a city shaped by ancient prophecy. It began in a cave, carved into the bones of a mountain near Mecca, where silence pressed against the heart of a solitary man. Night after night he retreated there, seeking clarity in a world fractured by tribal gods and wandering truths, unaware that the shadows around him were gathering toward a moment that would shape nations. The desert below him was vast, a world still echoing with the footsteps of Ishmael's sons, a world where memory lived longer than monuments, and the ache of an ancient exclusion still moved like a pulse beneath the sand. And into that silence came a voice. It descended like a weight, not gentle, but overwhelming, commanding the trembling man to recite words he had never known. A presence that claimed to be an angel pressed these sounds into his soul, though the night offered no sign of the God of Abraham, who once walked with patriarchs and prophets. And thus began the message that would rise into the world as Islam, a faith that would reshape deserts into kingdoms and tribes into armies, a faith born not simply as a new path, but as a reclamation. Its foundation was not merely devotion, but correction, a rewriting of the ancient story that had split the house of Abraham. For Islam declared that the covenant did not pass through Isaac, but through Ishmael, the son who wandered, not the son who inherited, became in this new telling the chosen seed, the altar of sacrifice. Once fixed in the mountains of Moriah, was moved south into their own land, and the son laid upon it was no longer Isaac, but Ishmael. And with this single shift, the memory of a wound became a theology, the ache of millennia given the authority of revelation. The message spread across the desert like a rising storm. What began in a cave became a declaration carried by caravans, warriors, and tribes. The descendants of Ishmael, long fragmented, suddenly felt the gravity of a story restored. They were no longer the overlooked branch. They were the true heirs, the people through whom Abraham's faith had been purified. They looked at the Jews and said, "You altered the scriptures." They looked at the Christians and said, "You worship a man." And they looked at themselves and said, "We are the keepers of the final word in this new faith." The claims of the Torah and the gospel were folded beneath the authority of revelation given to Muhammad. The God of Israel was acknowledged. Yet the story of Israel was rewritten. Isaac receded into the background. Ishmael stood in the center, and the line of promise was redrawn in the sands of Arabia. And so Islam rose not only as a religion, but as a response, a voice rising from the wilderness where Ishmael once cried. It spoke the longing of a people who had known strength, but longed for covenant, a people who had known blessing, but longed for election. Their armies moved swiftly, not with the deliberation of empires past, but with the certainty of destiny reclaimed. Within a single century, lands once shaped by prophets of Israel fell beneath the crescent. Persia bowed, Egypt fell. Syria and Jerusalem opened their gates, not to a priesthood but to a new order. Upon the ruins of the ancient temple, a golden dome rose like a declaration over the very stone where Abraham once lifted a knife in obedience. And so the world saw a symbol, a reassertion of Ishmael's line standing over the memory of Isaac's covenant. Jews were allowed to live, but only in submission, under tax, under restrictions. Christians too. They were called people of the book, but the book they held was deemed incomplete. All must bow, not to the God of Israel as revealed through covenant and Messiah, but to the revelation given in a cave. A revelation that placed Ishmael where Isaac once stood. And so the ancient rivalry, once a whisper between brothers, became a war between faiths, a conflict not of borders but of stories. The Bible spoke of a promise through Isaac. Islam spoke of corruption and reversal. Scripture proclaimed Christ as the fulfillment of covenant. Islam denied his sonship, denied his crucifixion, denied the very center of the gospel. What began in a tent between Sarah and Hagar now thundered across continents. The wild man prophecy matured into empires. The longing of Ishmael carved itself into law, culture, and creed. And the world found itself caught between two testimonies, only one of which could be true. Yet even here, beneath the rise of Islam, mercy remained woven through the centuries. For the covenant did not exist to crush Ishmael's line, but to lead all lines toward redemption. The seed carried by Isaac would one day open its arms to every nation, including the sons of the wilderness. Still, the question lingered across the desert winds, carried from mosque to marketplace, from scholar to warrior. Who is the true heir of Abraham? And now that Islam had risen like a second dawn over the ancient lands, the world was forced to face the conflict, born in the womb of a single woman long ago. As this portion of the story settles into your thoughts, another question turns softly toward you. When history offers competing claims of truth, do you follow the story that flatters your identity, or the one that leads your heart toward the light that does not change? It has no river to feed it, no fertile plains to sustain it, no natural wealth to lure kingdoms to its gates. And yet Jerusalem has drawn more blood than any city beneath the heavens, a stone perched upon the spine of ancient hills. Small in stature, yet vast in meaning. It burns in the imagination of nations like a flame that refuses to die. Empires have marched for it. Prophets have wept over it. Angels have stood guard above it. And demons have whispered through its streets. For Jerusalem is not merely geography. It is verdict. It is the witness of a covenant and the battleground of two competing claims. The chosen son and the son who believes he should have been chosen. When God first spoke to Abraham of the land, his words stretched like a border drawn by eternity. From the river of Egypt to the great river, this land, he said, would belong to Abraham's offspring, sealed with promise, not by force. Later, he named Canaan. And later still, Jerusalem rose from obscurity to become the throne of the promise. David claimed it. Solomon crowned it with a temple, and the presence of God descended there like fire settling upon gold. Jerusalem became the heart of a people shaped by covenant, their prayers turning toward it even in exile, their songs aching for it across the centuries. Every stone remembered the footsteps of priests. Every courtyard echoed with sacrifice. Every gate pulsed with anticipation of the Messiah who would walk through it. Yet the same city, luminous with divine choosing, awakened the grievance of Ishmael's descendants. They saw the covenant drawn through Isaac, the land assigned to Jacob, the throne promised to David, and their inheritance lay outside the gates. When Islam rose, it did not forget this wound. It reached toward Jerusalem with the desire of a son reclaiming what he believed was rightly his. In the year 638, Muslim armies entered the city, claiming it not through covenant but through conquest. They renamed it Al-Quds, the holy, where the temple once stood. They built a shrine crowned in gold, the Dome of the Rock, a declaration hammered into stone that the story of Abraham must now be read through Ishmael's eyes. They placed their claim upon the very rock where Isaac had once been bound in faith, or where Ishmael, in their telling, had once lain beneath the knife. A rewriting of sacred geography, a theological siege, yet the Jews never surrendered their claim. For theirs was not built upon empire, but upon promise. Though scattered for nearly 2,000 years, they faced Jerusalem at every prayer, whispering next year in Jerusalem as though the city were a vow waiting in the mouth of God. In 1948, the nation rose again, like dry bones stirred by breath. Then in 1967, during the Six-Day War, the old city returned to their hands. For the first time since Rome, Jewish feet walked again upon the Temple Mount. Soldiers wept beside the ancient wall, not for victory, but for homecoming. And yet even in that moment, the conflict deepened, for the mount itself remained under Islamic administration. A fragile compromise masking an older fire. Why does the world tremble over this hill of stone? Why do nations rage at its gates? Because Jerusalem is not merely the capital of a modern state. It is the theatre of prophecy, the cradle of covenant, the future throne of the returning king. The prophets spoke of a day when Jerusalem would become a cup of staggering to all nations, when armies would gather around it, not through politics, but through the pull of destiny. The clash is inevitable, for two stories cannot both be true. Two inheritances cannot both hold the deed. Two sons cannot both be the chosen line. The Bible draws the line through Isaac. The Quran redraws it through Ishmael. And Jerusalem stands between them like a question carved into stone. Yet the city does not shake because of human claims alone. It shakes because heaven has assigned it a role that hell resists. Heavenly watchers stand upon its heights, guarding a promise older than the world. Darker forces coil beneath it, whispering that the covenant can be broken, and humanity caught between these unseen armies, fights, wars it does not understand. Every treaty is temporary because the conflict is eternal. Every negotiation trembles because prophecy does not negotiate. Jerusalem waits for its king, and until he returns, every power that denies his throne will contend for the city that bears his name. As the weight of this truth settles upon you, consider this gentle question. When the world contests what God has claimed, does your heart follow the noise of nations or the stillness of the one whose throne will stand above every city and every story? They have the scrolls. They have the lineage. They have the land spoken by God into Abraham's night. Yet they walk as a people with veiled eyes, carrying a covenant they do not fully see. The house of Israel moves through history like a lantern covered by its own cloth, glowing with promise, yet dimmed by a mystery older than their wandering. From childhood, the sons and daughters of Jacob recite words that shape the spine of their identity. The Lord has chosen us. The Lord has given us the Torah. The Lord has placed his name among us. Each syllable feels like the echo of Sinai, still trembling across generations. They remember the mountain that burned without consuming itself, the voice that carved law into stone, the presence that once rested above the ark like a hovering fire. Yet the story that began in a garden and narrowed through Abraham and sharpened through David was always meant to open into something far greater than rituals or kingdoms. Every prophet, from the mournful Isaiah to the fiery Zechariah, spoke of one who would come through Israel, not simply to restore them, but to redeem the world. A root from Jesse, a child from Bethlehem, a king who would enter not upon a war horse, but upon a donkey, a lamb led to slaughter, a figure who would be pierced yet exalted. The map was drawn across centuries, each prophecy a stone in a path leading toward a carpenter who carried eternity in his breath. But when he came, walking among fishermen and beggars, healing with hands scarred by compassion rather than conflict, Israel did not recognize the shape of its own promise. They expected a throne. He offered a cross. They expected deliverance from Rome. He carried deliverance from sin. They expected a Messiah crowned in gold. He wore a crown of thorns. And so the nation chosen to cradle the Redeemer became the nation that stumbled over him, not out of malice, but out of blindness. Paul looked at his own people with anguish deeper than words, saying, a veil lies over their hearts when the old covenant is read. Not a curse, but a covering, not rejection, but delay, a mystery that heaven allows until the appointed hour. Yet Israel's identity did not vanish. It hardened like clay around a sacred fire. Through exile and empire, they clung to the land and the law. When empires drove them out, they whispered next year in Jerusalem. When silence stretched for centuries, they still believed the Holy One would keep his word. Their endurance became a miracle. A people scattered, yet never dissolved. A nation without borders, yet never erased. A memory held alive by covenant more than geography. But when the modern nation was reborn, when Hebrew once more rose on the wind of the Middle East, when the soil drank the footsteps of its ancient people again, the world witnessed a sign that prophecy had not fallen asleep. Still the mystery remained. The people chosen to bear the line of Messiah had not yet embraced the Messiah himself. Jerusalem stands rebuilt, yet the Temple Mount is silent. Waiting for glory it has not yet seen. The prayers tucked into the cracks of the western wall rise like incense, but return unanswered in the way the heart longs for. Israel guards a throne without recognizing the king who once entered its gates on the colt of a humble beast. They carry the promise, but not the person. They defend the covenant, but not the fulfillment. And yet heaven watches them not with scorn, but with longing, for the story is not finished. The veil is not eternal. The prophet saw a day when the blindness would break like dawn. Zechariah spoke with trembling words. They shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as for an only son. A mourning not of despair but of revelation. The moment when the cloth is lifted from the lantern and Israel sees the light it has carried for millennia. That day, the elders will weep. The rabbis will tremble. The sons and daughters will lift their heads as if waking from a long and sorrowful dream. And the covenant, once held like a sealed scroll, will open into the fullness for which it was always written. Yet until that time, Israel stands as a paradox, chosen yet unseeing, guarded yet vulnerable, possessing the map but not recognizing the destination. They wait for Messiah while the Messiah waits for them. They pray at the wall while the one who heard them stands at the door. As this truth settles into the quiet of your heart, consider this question. If the people who carried the promise can miss the one it points to, how careful must every soul be to recognize the light when it stands before them, and not cling to the shadow that was only meant to prepare the way? They remember the rejection. It moves through their blood like an inherited flame, shaping the pride of tribes and the sorrow of centuries. The descendants of Ishmael, scattered yet bound by memory, carry within them the echo of a blessing they believe slipped through their fingers. They look backward through time and see Abraham, see the tent, see the birth of Isaac and the sending away of Ishmael. And in that ancient departure, they see the beginning of a fracture that still pulses beneath modern borders. Ishmael, the firstborn in their eyes, the rightful heir by the customs of men, left the house not with a staff of authority, but with a skin of water, stepping into a wilderness that became both exile and identity, the prophecy spoken over him, a wild man dwelling in defiance of his brothers, did not fade with his bones. It grew into the temperament of tribes hardened by heat and survival, tribes who felt the sting of being children of Abraham, yet not children of the covenant. And as the centuries unfolded, this wound did not heal. It shaped the imagination of kingdoms. While Israel awaited a Messiah who had already come, the line of Ishmael burned with the longing of a lost inheritance. They watched empires rise and fall upon lands once promised to Isaac. And they asked the question their ancestors whispered in the dark, if Abraham is our father too, why is the promise not ours? And into this longing stepped a new revelation. In the 7th century, from the sands of Arabia, A prophet arose who claimed not to begin a faith but to restore it. He spoke of Abraham not through Isaac but through Ishmael. He declared that Jews distorted the scriptures, that Christians committed blasphemy by lifting Jesus above prophet and man. And he offered the children of the desert a story where they were not the rejected line but the rightful heirs. In the Quran, the fracture is rewritten. The altar is moved from Moriah to Mecca. The son bound upon it is not Isaac but Ishmael. The covenant is reassigned. The narrative of choice is reversed. And with that reversal, the descendants of Ishmael found a theological home for their ancient wound. Islam did not erase the pain. It canonized it. It shaped the frustration of millennia into a sacred identity. A fire sanctified by revelation. And with that sanctification came a war, not merely of territory but of truth. The cross stood at the center of this conflict like a sword buried in the earth. For if Jesus is the Son of God, then Ishmael is not the chosen line. If the crucifixion is real, then the covenant flows through Isaac. If the resurrection is true, then no later prophet can claim the final word. Islam denies these, not because the ideas are small, but because they strike at the core of what it exists to restore. To accept the cross would be to dismantle the entire structure raised in Ishmael's honor. And so the resistance hardened. For centuries, the sword and the creed marched together. Caliphates rose, spreading influence across continents, pushing against lands where prophets of Israel once walked. Jerusalem fell beneath their armies, and the Dome of the Rock rose above the place where the covenant once shone like fire. The wild man's hand was against every man, and every man's hand against him, not in cruelty but in destiny. Yet the war is not only outward. The deeper conflict is spiritual. Islam's denial of the Son is not a footnote. It is the foundation of its identity. To affirm the Son would be to surrender the restored birthright. To acknowledge the crucifixion would be to admit that redemption came not through desert revelation, but through a carpenter nailed upon rough wood. And so the sons of Ishmael stand in tension not only with Israel, but with the cross itself. Their prayers rise 5 times a day toward a city not mentioned in ancient covenant. Their scriptures reshape the stories once carried by Israel, and their identity leans upon a reinterpretation of the very narrative heaven had written long before. Yet in all this, God has not turned his face away. The wilderness that shaped Ishmael is the same place where many of his descendants today see visions and dreams, encounters with the one their creed denies. For the mercy of God reaches into deserts as easily as into temples. The blood of Abraham does not guarantee salvation. And the rejection of ancient days does not define eternal destiny. The cross remains open. Its invitation stretching across nations shaped by pain and pride alike. And as the centuries turn, a question rises from the heart of this long struggle. It is not whether Ishmael was blessed, for Scripture says he was. It is not whether his descendants matter, for God has watched them from the beginning. The question is whether the yearning for inheritance can find its home not in land or lineage, but in the Lamb who restores sons from every nation. For the covenant was never meant to remain locked to flesh. It was meant to open through faith. As this truth lingers before you, consider this. When a wound becomes an identity, can it ever heal without surrender? And can any lineage find peace until it kneels before the one who alone can rewrite the story of the human heart? 2 lineages stand facing one another across the long valley of history, each claiming Abraham, each bearing his blood, each carrying a memory older than their own nations. One stands beneath the banner of promise, the other beneath the banner of longing, and between them rises a cross that neither fully expected, yet both ultimately need. From the sons of Isaac came a people shaped by revelation, guardians of a covenant born in the fire of Sinai. From the sons of Ishmael came a people shaped by endurance, carriers of a fierce dignity forged in the wilderness. Both lines multiplied into empires and cultures. Both raised prophets and poets. Both touched the edges of the world. Yet neither could escape the story written before either mother had conceived her child, that redemption would come not through bloodline but through a single seed. A seed carried by one family but destined for every family. And so the two streams flowed through time, parallel yet diverging, sometimes clashing like storms, sometimes running silently beneath the same sky, but never merging, not until the cross. For the moment the Son of God hung between heaven and earth, the history of inheritance changed. The covenant held by Israel did not vanish. It reached its fullness. The longing carried by Ishmael's line did not disappear. It found its answer. The divide that began in a tent widened in a wilderness and matured in cities and empires met its turning point in one act of surrender. The Lamb opened a door neither lineage could open by merit or birth, and yet the world, still clinging to ancestral wounds, often refuses the invitation. Israel guards the land but not the Lamb. Islam defends its prophet but denies the Son, and the nations stand bewildered as the conflict intensifies. Unaware that they are watching not merely political rage but the final tremors of an ancient spiritual fault line preparing to break, the prophet spoke of a day when the nations would gather against Jerusalem, when the city would become the fulcrum of the world's shaking. They saw armies rising like a dark tide, alliances formed with quiet ambition, kingdoms moving as though pulled by unseen hands. They saw a figure named Gog drawing nations behind him like shadows following a fading sun. They saw the mountains trembling and the heavens shaking, not because of human might, but because God himself would enter the battlefield. Ezekiel described weapons failing by divine disruption, confusion spreading through armies, fire falling upon lands far from Jerusalem, corpses filling valleys that would take months to cleanse. Zechariah saw the city pierced, the people shattered, the houses plundered, the women violated, and half the city taken into exile. Yet in the darkest moment he saw a light break upon the Mount of Olives, a light shaped like feet that once walked the shores of Galilee. The mountain split, forming a valley for the remnant to escape, and the one whom Israel once rejected became the one they recognized with tears that cleansed generations of blindness. They looked upon him whom they pierced and mourned as for an only son. Mourning gave way to revelation, and revelation gave way to cleansing. A fountain opened in Jerusalem, washing away impurity, washing away rebellion, washing away the long night of unbelief. And at that moment, the story of Isaac reached its fulfillment. But what of Ishmael? What of the line that wandered? The nations that rose from the wilderness? The sons shaped by exile and fire? Isaiah saw something astonishing, a vision that bridged the oldest wound ever carved in the house of Abraham. He saw Egypt, ancient enemy of Israel, worshipping the Lord. He saw Assyria, land of conquerors and captors, called the work of God's hands. He saw Israel standing beside them, not above them, not against them, but with them. Blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. In that single vision, the three great branches of Abraham's world stood united under the kingship of the Messiah. The wildness of Ishmael's legacy did not disappear. It was redeemed. The blindness of Israel did not remain. It was lifted. The nations that contended for Jerusalem became nations healed by the one who reigns from Jerusalem. The war born in a tent ended at a throne. But until that day arrives, the world moves through its final hours with hearts unprepared. Nations align themselves with causes rather than truth. People take sides with flags rather than with the cross. And many who name the name of Christ forget the call that was placed upon them. Not to take up the sword of politics, but to carry the light that pierces all shadows. For in the end, only one allegiance will stand. Not the allegiance of Isaac alone or Ishmael alone. Not the allegiance of East or West. Not the allegiance of temples or mosques or governments. But the allegiance to the one whose throne is carved from righteousness and whose kingdom cannot be shaken. And so the call comes to the church, not as a whisper, but as a trumpet. Pray for Israel, for the veil will soon tear. Pray for the sons of Ishmael, for the wilderness still waits for redemption. Pray for the nations, for the hour grows late. Preach Christ with clarity, with courage, with tenderness, for he alone heals the wound no treaty can mend. And prepare your heart. The King is near. He comes not with the politics of men, but with the fire of God. He comes to end the ancient war. He comes to reign from the city written on his palms. He comes to gather those who bear his name and to confront those who defy his throne. In this final scene, both houses of Abraham will bow, not to claim the covenant, but to honor the one who fulfills it. As this last chapter settles over your spirit, one question remains, gentle yet unyielding. When the King returns and the ancient divisions crumble, will you be found clinging to lineage, to nation, to pride, or standing in the light of the Lamb who alone can make enemies into brothers and turn the wounds of history into the worship of eternity?